So good evening. We'll start an actual shiur now that we got a little bit inspired. It's obviously about Yerushalayim. It's about Yerushalayim. It's a city that touches us all. I'm going to start off with a short Dvar Torah that really describes the people of Yerushalayim. In other words, when you call someone an Ish Yerushalayim, it's an honor. And I'll share with you the following. So this is going to be a Dvar Torah leading to our shiur. Here we have it. In actually tomorrow's Daf Yomi, there's a discussion that relates to Sukkot and the water libation. We all know that in the Bet HaMikdash, they had wine libations. Okay, it was a practice. It's in the Torah. You come to the altar, you pour some wine, you fulfill a mitzvah. Wine is mentioned in the Torah. The oral tradition teaches us that once a year, during one holiday, there's a requirement to also do a libation with water. Obviously, Sukkot. Now, due to the fact that this was an area that the practice is based on the oral tradition, and there were those who didn't agree, who did not accept and did not believe the oral tradition. So there was a level of tension in the Bet HaMikdash. And when we were able to do that water libation of pouring the water on the altar, we celebrated. And it was called the Simchat Bet HaShoeva. So the Talmud wonders, is this water libation that was done in the temple, is it done in the morning only, or perhaps at night as well? That's a question the Talmud addresses. So comes a rabbi by the name of Rav Ashi, okay? And Rav Ashi wants to prove that the water libation was done only in the morning of Sukkot, not in the evening time, but only in the morning. Because there's a story that the rabbis share that you should know. When the water libation was done, the people standing there were concerned that perhaps that Kohen was not doing it appropriately. Perhaps that Kohen was following a practice of the Sadducees who do not believe in the tradition. And now imagine if you're a Kohen and you're at Tzduki, meaning you don't believe in the oral tradition. So when you are carrying that pitcher, pitcher of water to go ahead and do a libation, you don't want to do it. So what some of them would do is that they would pour the water over their feet, just not to do the mitzvah that they don't believe in. As a result of that, the tradition was that when a Kohen would do the water libation, they would say to him, Hagbe yadecha, lift your hand, meaning do the water libation in a very obvious way. Why? Shepa'am echad, one time, nisech al gabe raglav, one time, a Kohen who did not accept the traditions, poured water over his feet. And what happened? Veragmuhu kol ha'am be'etrogehen. So there were a lot of people there who wanted the rabbinic tradition to be followed. So you know what they did? They took their etrogim and they stoned the Kohen. Now, the Talmud tells us, listen here, why did they have to share with us this tradition that they used their etrogim and threw the etrogim at him? So obviously, the Talmud is trying to prove that water libation is only done in the morning, because when did people carry their etrog? Carrying the etrog is a morning mitzvah, not an evening mitzvah. So that is what the Talmud uses as a source to prove to us that water libations were done only in the morning. Now, Tosfot asks a question. Because we learned in the Talmud in Sukkah that you should know there was the minhagan shel anshei Yerushalayim. People of Yerushalayim, the righteous people of Yerushalayim had a practice that they would carry their lulav and etrog throughout the day. In the words of the Talmud, Adam yotzeh mi beito velulavo biyado. A person leaves home in the morning, he's carrying the lulav. Holech lebet hakneset, lulavo biyado. Kore kriyat shma umitpalel velulavo biyado. The Talmud is basically telling us that these great Anshei Yerushalayim would not let go of their lulav and etrog. Kore baTorah. Everything. Holech lebaker cholim, lenachem avelim, lulavo biyado. So the question Tosfot asks is, wait a second. How can you prove to me that water libation is only done in the morning from the fact that they all had their etrogim? We see that Anshe Yerushalayim had their etrog throughout the day. So this is a question that Tosfot asks. So I would like to share with you an answer. And this answer is hinted by others as well. You should know the people that threw their etrogim at someone that perhaps was doing something wrong, that's not an Ish Yerushalayim. That is a person who is an Am. You know, he's a member of our nation, member of our faith, and yes, believes in traditions, but he's not a refined person. A refined person is not going to throw his etrog in the Bet HaMikdash, even when things are done inappropriately. The Anshe Yerushalayim, on the other hand, if you have that title, that Yerushalayim has had an impact on you, it is your identity. And your identity is one of concern for others. You realize that you are in the city of unity. In the city of unity, yes, there are times that you have to comment on things that are not done appropriately, but you're not going to throw your etrog. It is only if you are a simple member of the Am that you're going to throw an etrog. So that's an insight I would like to share leading into the class. But now it's time for the class itself. And it's a shiur, okay? And what we're going to discuss today is a statement in the Talmud, that has been considered confusing for many, many centuries. It's a discussion that I once had here in a shiur b'ivrit probably about 8-9 years ago, and have not had the opportunity to review it, at least as far as I remember. So I think here that we're sitting by computers and we can look at maps and we are celebrating Yerushalayim in the Old City, I think it would be an appropriate time to discuss it, perhaps with a few new details. What you see in front of you is a map of the Old City of Yerushalayim. You are familiar with it. I think that before we all had our maps on our phones, often when visiting Yerushalayim, you would pick up in hotel lobbies these maps that the Ministry of Tourism would have. And, it was a map that you would carry with you as you walk around the city. So this is obviously the Old City that we are all familiar with. The Old City itself, like good old Roman cities, was divided into quarters, okay? You have here the Muslim quarter that we know. You could live there if your name is Itamar Ben-Gvir, or if you politically are very, very right-wing and confident, you could live there. There's the Christian quarter, and there's the Armenian quarter, and there's a Jewish quarter. We're very familiar with the city. We all know that there's an area called Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount. The Har HaBayit itself is a platform. It's a platform. We've studied how it was built. South of the city, in an area that is not walled today, it is known as Ir David, and this is the area where during the days of King David was the actual city of Yerushalayim. In the days of David HaMelech, there was nothing to the north. A fellow called Aravna had a threshing floor right around here, but that was not Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim itself was the area to the south, right here to the south. Fine, so we're familiar with it. To the right, we all know, is Har HaZeitim, Mount Olives. And I think it's logical to understand that although Yerushalayim expanded, it expanded during the first temple to this area. It expanded also to the area around here. It expanded at some point also to the north. The city itself logically never expanded, as far as we know, to the east, to the east, meaning towards Har HaZeitim, because this is an area that's designated for graves. Okay, that's what's logical. Fine. Now, there's a little bit of a problem, and there's a problem based on a section in the Talmud in Shavuot. The Talmud in Shavuot talks about the sanctification of Yerushalayim as the Jews returned from the Babylonian exile. It was a small group, and they re-entered Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim has sanctity that is very relevant regarding halachic matters. For example, if you have a field anywhere in the land and there's a yield from the field, a percentage of that has to come with you to Yerushalayim for you to consume in Yerushalayim. We call that Maaser Sheni. Now, in a situation where it's too much, you could transfer the sanctity from the fruit to money, carry the money to Yerushalayim, and use it to purchase goods that you're going to be consuming there and eat it within the city. Now, how do you determine what the boundaries of the city are? So they sanctify the city. Okay, that's called Maaser Sheni. So too, there are sections of meat that you only eat within the city. The Kochim Kalim, right? You bring a Thanksgiving. There's meat there, there are breads there, they have to be consumed within the city. So the boundaries of the city are very, very important. And the Talmud talks about the fact that during the Second Temple, at some point, they expanded the city, but the expansion did not have the full status of Yerushalayim. So it brought a level of complexity. So comes a rabbi, his name is Abba Shaul. And Abba Shaul tells us that you should know there was an expansion. And the expansion occurred, and listen carefully, Shnei Bitzin, 2 swamps or 2 pools. Hayu were present, Behar HaMishcha. Mishcha relates to shemen, oil. Where did oil come from? Olives. What is the mountain of that creates something that you smear? It's obviously talking about Mount Olives, Har HaZeitim. So the simple reading of the Talmud here is that there were 2 quote-unquote bitzin on Har HaMishcha, on Mount Olives. There was a tachton, there was a lower one, and an upper one. And Abba Shaul shares with us that you should know that the lower area, the lower pool, was sanctified completely. Nitkacha bechol elu. In other words, whatever requirements there are to sanctify the city of Yerushalayim and have it be considered a bona fide part of Yerushalayim, where you could eat Maaser Sheni and you could eat sacrificial meat, the lower one was 100% acceptable and part of Yerushalayim. On the other hand, he notes that the Elyonah, the upper one, lo nitkacha bechol elu. They didn't sanctify it. Okay, now the Talmud does note that you should know that there was a debate: what areas are Yerushalayim, what areas are not Yerushalayim. Fine. Now the mystery here, and this is our mystery for the night. I'm not going to go through all the details that the Talmud discusses. What Abba Shaul seems to be telling us is that there was an expansion of Yerushalayim towards Har HaMishcha, towards Har HaZeitim. And there were pools, one lower pool, one upper pool, and somehow the city expanded in that direction, which seems to be problematic. It's possible, it's not impossible, even though we didn't find anything, it's possible, but there's some difficulties. Although there are some difficulties, many great rabbis throughout the ages, who were perhaps not extremely familiar with the layout, accepted that as a fact. And how do I know it? So listen to the following. Right here, you have a picture, it's from a Google Maps. Okay, so we have here an official picture from the Google. And what you have here, it's a little bit difficult to know. This is the old city here. Okay, Western Wall. You see the Western Wall. Dome of the Rock, Dome of the Rock. Obviously, you have here the Jewish quarter. Fine, this is the old city. Over here on the right side, Har HaZitim. Har HaZitim, you could expect to find a lot of graves, and you do. Now, what Google tells us is that if you make it to the top of the mount, there is a grave that's called Huldah HaNeviah's tomb. This is where Huldah, there was a Neviah. Her name was Huldah. She was in the days of Yirmiyahu. So there is a tradition that this Huldah is buried on Mount Olives right here. And you could go there. You could go with a tour group. You could hear stories about her. You could pray there. Fine. It doesn't seem problematic. A grave on Har HaZitim, that's not problematic. The problems develop when we start reading traditional text. Now, by the way, this is a postcard from the late 19th century, where they have here a postcard people would send to show that they visited the Holy Land, Har HaZitim, and on Har HaZitim itself, they note Kever Huldah HaNeviah. It played a significant role in tradition. The tomb of the prophetess Huldah. Now, where is there a problem? So let's study the words of the Rambam. And as you know, the Rambam, Maimonides didn't get it from his own thinking. It is based on older traditions. The Rambam tells us the following. So we're going to be learning here. Yerushalayim mekudeshet meshar ha'ayarot hamukafot choma. You should know the city of Jerusalem is sanctified more than any surrounded cities in the country. Fine. And he gives us a list of details that relate to Yerushalayim due to the fact that it has a high level of sanctity. And the Rambam tells us, Ve'ein mekaimim ba kvarot. You're not allowed to have graves there. You don't bury people within the city. You bury them outside of the city. Okay, we're talking about the walled city. Now, the Rambam does share with us that there's a tradition of an exception to the rule, that there were those who were buried within Yerushalayim. Chutz, where does the exception apply? Number one, Kivrei Bet David. Those of the household of David were buried within the city. That creates a little bit of a problem. The location in Yerushalayim where people claim King David is buried would not historically most probably be within the old city. Perhaps, yes, there's a little bit of a debate, but that's not our issue today. Our issue is that Rambam tells us that there was a tradition that although there are no graves in the old city of Yerushalayim, there's an exception for Kever Huldah. Huldah is within the city. And why did they leave it there? Well, these special people were buried there from a long time ago. They did not move them. They were left there. Now, the problem is as follows. If we are being told, and Maimonides testifies, that there is a tradition that Huldah is buried within the old city of Yerushalayim, how on earth is there a tradition, quote unquote, that Huldah is on the top of Mount Olives, as we saw by Google? How do we deal with it? So one of the earlier rabbis that addresses it is Rabbi Yosef of Trani. We talked about him in the past. We talked about his wife's burial spot in Tzfat. And he addresses this question. In other words, you had the problem about Kever Huldah, she'amru, that there's a tradition in our sources. She'ayta betoch Yerushalayim. We know that there's a tradition that she was buried within the city. And now it is Berosh Har, and now everyone knows, and everyone goes to pray at the Kever of Huldah, and it's on the top of Mount Olives. How is that possible? So Rabbi Trani tells us, don't see that as a contradiction, because he notes the section of the Talmud that we learned in Shavuot, that the city was expanded, and there was a Bitza Elyona, there was an upper pool. So therefore, since he read the Talmud as a source that Jerusalem expanded to the east towards Mount Olives, So therefore, Mount Olives was within Yerushalayim. Har HaZitim was within Yerushalayim once upon a time. That's what he tells us. It is difficult to accept, very difficult to accept, because we always know that Mount Olives is a section outside of the city. It's an area of burial. It's an area where the Kohen Gadol burnt the red heifer. It doesn't make sense. But Rabbi Trani has a reading in the Talmud, and he runs with it, and he's not the first one, because Rab Ishtar Parche, this was a great 13th, 14th century authority, also says the same. And he shares sources. Yerushalayim was much larger, and therefore, don't be so shocked that Kever Hulda was on Har HaZitim, because Jerusalem was much bigger. Fine. So the person we're going to talk about who viewed it in a very different way is a rabbi. His name was Rabbi Yosef Schwartz. Rabbi Yosef Schwartz. Extremely knowledgeable on all matters that relate to Eretz Yisrael. He had a love of the land. He had expertise. He tried to identify every biblical and every location that's mentioned in the oral tradition and rabbinic sources based on names that Arabs gave a place. So he had an expertise and great knowledge, and he recorded everything in his work, Pri Haaretz. And Rabbi Schwartz is a wonderful source for the past 200 years as people we turn to understand and appreciate the land itself. Rabbi Schwartz actually once testified in court in Philadelphia. Perhaps some other time we could talk about how Rabbi Schwartz lands up in Philadelphia and why he's testifying in court. But he now notices that people were going to pray on Mount Olives at Har HaZitim by Kever Hulda. They're making their way to Kever Hulda. He knows very well that in rabbinic sources, quoted by the Rambam and others, Kever Hulda is within Yerushalayim historically. And he has this problem. It makes no sense that a grave on the top of Har HaZitim is attributed to a woman who, in our tradition, was buried in Yerushalayim proper. So therefore, he notes, you should know, Kol Mevin, anyone that has any understanding, Yitpaleh, he'll be surprised. He'll be very surprised. Beshamo Omrim, when you hear Shekever Hulda HaNeviah Hu Berosh Har HaZitim, whoever hears that is quite surprised. And he writes that this is something that everyone believes. People start believing things. And it's Mekubal u'metukan be'inei kol ha'am. And he notes, Ve'olchim shama litpalel ala keveru. They go pray. It became very, very popular, extremely popular, unfortunately too popular, to make our way to graves. And perhaps it has roots in our tradition, but roots does not indicate that we make it into a whole religion. So going to Kever Hulda became a major popular practice. And Rabbi Schwartz tells us that this is extremely problematic. Now, obviously, the earlier authorities relied on the fact that the Talmud in Shavuot tells us that Jerusalem had an expansion on Har HaMishcha, Shnei Betzim, the two pools, the two swamps or pools that have to do with an expansion. So clearly Jerusalem expanded. And the Talmud does tell us that this is taking place on Har HaMishcha. So comes Rabbi Schwartz and he says, you should know that our reading in the Talmud is a ta'ut sofer. It's a mistake of a scribe. It's a mistake of the scribe. Because the two beats in, says Rabbi Schwartz, these two swamps that indicate that there was an expansion of Jerusalem was not to the east, was not on Har HaZitim. It was Shnei Bitin Ayu Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem itself. And he finds another rabbinic source in the Tosefta, and he finds a Yerushalmi, that the intention is that what we are being told that yes, there was an expansion, and yes, there was a debate what the status of those new areas was, but it was regarding Yerushalayim itself, not Har HaZitim. Okay. Now, he did a little bit of research, and he tells us that you should know that this Kever Hulda is a holy site, not just for Jews, but for Muslims as well. And not just for Muslims, but for Christians as well. And everyone attributes someone else buried there. And if you want to know the whole story, it's one that's quite interesting and not what I want to cover. But bottom line is, he tells us that you should know that this is extremely disturbing, that Jews are making their way to a burial site that we don't even know if it's a Jewish one. And therefore, he says that such practices, ha'anashim, ha'olchim shama litpalel, people that go there without knowing who's buried there or if it's Jewish at all, I say regarding them, Ani omer lashon chachamenu zichronam livracha, I'm going to quote a saying of the rabbis, that they are ovdei avodah zara b'tahara. In other words, they are doing something, unfortunately, that borders on pagan, but at least with pure intentions. Rabbi Schwartz is extremely unhappy with things that are not researched, things that are not logical, things that are impossible. And what he seems to be telling us is proven by archaeology. It's proven by other Talmudic sources. Yerushalayim did not expand to the east. Now, where did it, yes, expand? In other words, if we look at the period when our ancestors returned in the days of Ezra, Nehemiah, Zerubbabel, it was a small group of 40,000 people. Yes, it expanded, thank God, throughout the Second Temple period. But the expansions that took place were, yes, to the west, and yes, to the north. But we would like to find out if the Talmud tells us, if Abba Shaul tells us that there was an expansion that was debated, and it had to do with Shnei Bitzin and Har HaZeitim. Where was it? Where actually was it? So we've all heard of, in the United States, where many cities have biblical roots. There's a place called Bethesda, Maryland, for example. Maybe there are other Bethesda in the United States. So Bethesda is very important for the Christians because Bethesda talks about a pool, or two pools actually. And the Bethesda pools were north of the Temple Mount. Why are they important to the Christians? Because Yoshke, according to their beliefs, performed his miracles there, or the leper, whatever things that are not extremely important for us Torah Jews to be knowledgeable in. But nevertheless, we know that there was a place called Bethesda. Now, where does the name come from, Bethesda? So some say that actually it was not Bethesda because this English translation is based on a Greek or a Latin translation that originates in a Hebrew translation that probably was really Aramaic because the masses were using at the time Aramaic. So some believe that Bethesda comes from the word Bethesda, like Chesed, the house of Chesed. Chesed was one done there. Fine, perhaps the pool of Bethesda relates to Bethesda. There's another possibility. Right here, you see Josephus. And this mugshot obviously indicates that, yes, he was Jewish. And we're going to be quoting something from Josephus. And again, we're going to have to deal with translations. And he shares with us a little bit about the history of Jerusalem. And he talks about when Cestius came into the city at some point in the 1st century, he set the part called Bezetha, which is also called the new city, Sinopolis, on fire. Now, what Cestius did is not relevant for us. What is, yes, relevant for us is that he is talking about a new area, and he calls it Bezetha, not Bethesda or Bethesda, but Bezeta. Now, Bezeta relates very well to the word Bet Zait, a house of olives, Zait. So it could be that in that area north of the Temple Mount, if you make your way as a kid, I remember going to a hotel called the Hollyland Hotel, if I remember correctly. And it was way past Beit Vegan. And they had there a replica of the city of Yerushalayim from the Second Temple period. Eventually, it was moved to the Israel Museum. You could see it in the Israel Museum. It's outdoors. They made adjustments as historians discovered and archaeologists discovered a few new things. They made some adjustments. So if you go there, you will see that north of the Temple Mount, north of the Har HaBayit, there are actually two pools. And in those two pools, right, they're called the area, based on what Josephus tells us, the area of Beis Zeta. Now, for me, this gives some level of clarity that perhaps, and this is also mentioned quite closely by others as well, the rabbis had a tradition that Yerushalayim expanded in an area that is called Beit Zeta, something to do with Zait. Yerushalayim expanded in an area, and the area of expansion had the name Zait. Maybe there were olives there, maybe it was a fellow's name was Zait. At some point, unfortunately, someone saw in text Zait and Yerushalayim, and he read about an expansion. So it's very easy to confuse Zait with Har HaZetim. And therefore, by the time the edition that we have of the Talmud became popular, the expansion that is mentioned is on Har HaMishcha, on Mount Olives, when in reality, the expansion occurred, but to the north. And this is 100% proven because Josephus himself talks about the first wall. You know that if you make a tour in the old city, there's an area where you could see a wall. It's near in the Cardo. You could see a wall that makes its way from east to west. Why is there a wall in the middle of the city from east to west? Well, that is the original wall of the old city that's called the Choma Rishona. Then there was an expansion to the north where they put a second wall. That is a wall that is more or less where the northern wall of the old city is. And then actually Josephus makes mention that they started building a Choma Shlishit, which is outside of the wall, right? It's not far from Mea Sharim. There's actually a street called Choma Shlishit. Expansions took place indeed, but to the north, over Beit Zeta. That's what took place. And that obviously clarifies the issues that we are addressing, right? So now, obviously, as Rabbi Schwartz tells us, Hulda Nevi'as Mokum Kura, the tomb, is not her Mokum Kura. It's nothing to do with her, period. It's a tradition that just developed, and others, there's actually names of what Christian woman, Pelagia, I think her name was, of how she landed up there. Machnishkin Chilek, as they say. She is clearly buried somewhere around here. We don't know where. When the Talmud tells us that there was an expansion, it was an expansion here in the Muslim quarter. Here were the pools of Beit Zata, or Beit Chizda if you want, and here were the expansions. And that is proven. So now we know how to read a section of the Talmud. And we also know that sometimes there are traditions that were lost. What's magnificent about this always is the fact that you have people that put time and effort and energy into understanding Yerushalayim. In other words, to go ahead and do research and find out about every angle and about every street and every location has to indicate a love for the city, a connection to the place. No, as a child, we lived in Yerushalayim, and I used to walk to school. I would walk to school, and there was a time that we were living in Sharei Chesed, and the school was downtown near Machne Yehuda, and I would walk through the old neighborhoods, the nachlaot and alleyways of old cities, of areas that are not part of the old city, but from the earlier neighborhoods that were built outside of Yerushalayim. And there was a relationship, in essence, that you develop with the land as you walk it. And when I would return later, when I unfortunately haven't been in Eretz Yisrael for over 7 years, but when you return later and you walk those same routes, right? You return to a childhood, but you could actually return to something much greater than it, right? Every step in Yerushalayim is a step of connection. Our tradition teaches us that there was a big debate among halachic authorities that relate to boat rides, because technically speaking, we are told that a person is not supposed to get on a boat on the last half of the week. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, you don't get onto a boat. If you do need, only Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. Now, it obviously was extremely complex and quite limiting. So we are told that if it's for a dvar mitzvah, it would be permissible, right? If your journey is for the sake of a mitzvah, that would be fine. So the poskim obviously have great discussions what is and not considered a mitzvah. So they note that clearly if you're making your way to Eretz Israel, that is a mitzvah. Fine, that's simple. All Torah Jews know that. But then comes the Magen Avraham, a great 17th century authority, and he says, you should know, don't think that it is only a mitzvah if you are making your way to Eretz Israel to live there. Even if you are visiting, it's considered a mitzvah. Why is a visit to Eretz Israel a mitzvah? So he says, our sources tell us that anyone that walks 4 amot, right? You walk 7 feet. In Eretz Israel, you have a portion in the world to come. You walk the land, and obviously this has to be with mindfulness. You walk the land and you feel a connection to your tradition, a connection to your land. That's considered a mitzvah. How much more so in Yerushalayim, taking those steps, walking the city, simply walking the city, thinking about the past and thinking about the gift of the present. The greatest problem of human existence is when there's no appreciation for the good we have, right? In other words, the abilities that we had 2 years ago before this virus were taken for granted. No one ever thought, and here, unfortunately, we are dealing with this challenge. We're dealing with this significant challenge. What we must take from it is appreciation for things that we couldn't do during this period of time. That's what it's all about, appreciation. And appreciation for something like being able to walk the streets of Yerushalayim, right? To make your way to the Kotel. There's a lot to be appreciative to the Almighty, to appreciate to those who gave everything for the sake of us having that experience. And whenever I speak to people who were around in 1967 and remember it, and everyone has their own memories of what an incredible time it was. Ma'afela la'ora, from the darkness and the fear and the concern to, thank God, an incredible salvation. And every time I speak to people that tell me a little bit about the first Shavuot right after the war, a week later, where you had tens of thousands of Jews just walking their way up to Yerushalayim, right? It is something to be grateful for, that in our days, right, we had a salvation that's on a biblical level in essence. We have to appreciate, and with all the challenges we face now, you hear often in many circles about people making kabbalas or kabbalot. In other words, an acceptance that I'm going to do A, B, C, and then, God Almighty, I'm negotiating with you that if I make this acceptance, you'll do good for me. I think that the Kabbalah that we have to accept during challenging times, and they are the bad news that rolled in a week ago from Miran, devastating news, devastating. And what we are dealing with here, the fact is that we're still dealing with this virus. Not good. I mean, you have to feel the pain of what's happening in India, devastating there as well. We're not in the greatest of times. The Kabbalah that we could accept upon ourselves is appreciating those things in the future. And how much more so does it relate to the city that 3 times a day we turn to in our prayer? And when we do merit, Bezrat Hashem, to walk those streets again, it's an obligation we have to turn to the Almighty with gratitude, turn to those who did their part in this world with gratitude, visit Givat HaTachmoshet, right? Ammunition Hill should be visited. and think about those, because that was the spot where the most difficult battle took place. And it was only because of those who were Moser Nefesh and gave their life to uproot the very the elite Jordanian warriors who were there. It was only those who gave their life fighting for that area that we have Yerushalayim today. Obviously, it's our obligation to remember them, to honor them, and express our gratitude. So this was a little bit of a discussion that's getting us in the Yom Yerushalayim mood. And hopefully we'll be mindful of it on Sunday night and Monday. And hopefully with our prayers that are always directed towards Yerushalayim, we should merit to hear good news. Only good news, a Yeshuos and a Chomos. And Bezrat Hashem, we should return to the state of Hoda'ah, the state of gratitude. And then we are indeed fulfilling our responsibility and our mission. Good evening.